Can you see me and hear me? Just wait a little bit longer for some more people to show up. Then we'll get started. Ah, good, good. It's a little bit weird just talking to myself is what it seems like. Not seeing an actual class of people. Let's see. Anyone who's still guests in here, feel free to type into the chat. You'll be prompted to sign in, create a little account. That way you can join us in the conversation if you like. Don't necessarily have to, though. It's a bummer. Do you want a big cup of coffee? It's really good coffee, too. It's Ethiopian and Javan combo. I recently started introducing my father to it because he was mostly drinking like Folgers and stuff, so I was trying to get him a little bit higher grade. We'll see if I converted him. Okay. Maybe I should turn on the light in here. Okay, so let's get there. There we go. Sounds good. That way we can wait for some people to get in, get settled, figure out any problems with the system for personal issues. Oh, yeah. You guys still see me? There we are. Six on Monday at 6, that is a go. Alright, everybody. So, first of all, welcome. My name's Misha. I'm going to be running a class on the sages. Trying to give both the historical context as well as the character of the sages who helped develop our current legal system. You can't give a truly historical perspective because in the Talmuds, the first and foremost position is theological. Also, what's very different is the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds are a little bit at odds at times in their descriptions of the sages. In particular, the Jerusalem Talmud focuses on the concept of reception of tradition, which means that one person passes the next, and that's how our Jewish legal system is supposed to function. Whereas the Babylonian one focuses more on an individual's merits and their innovation. And sometimes we'll even see the same story presented in slightly different manners because of this perspective. However, to get the full picture, I feel like it's important to know the historical perspective as well as the traditional narrative. Because what's most important is that the students who received the traditions in the Talmuds had a particular understanding that was supposed to go along with the teachings. This was what later generations were supposed to present and the manner they're supposed to present it in, which, just like the Torah, might not necessarily coincide with exact history, but was meant to be part of the national narrative and legal system. Let's see. So I'm planning on beginning with the Mishnaic sages. If anyone's familiar with the Mishnah, it's the first portion of the Talmud. It was codified by Yehuda Hanasi, or Judah the Prince. Traditionally, they're kind of defined in a descending order. You have like the Tanaim, which lead to the Amoraim, and so on until our own generation. However, I'm going to break it down a little bit differently because I want to also address what's occurring in the world at the time and what's affecting the concepts the sages carry with them. For the Mishnah, thankfully, I can kind of select who's a prominent sage based on Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers. Whoever has statements in there is generally considered to be a strong authority, though I'm also going to throw in a few personal favorites of mine at later classes. As for myself, I have a background. When I went to college, I started as a history major, and I spent time in several different yeshivot, and I've personally been studying both history and Torah since probably when I was about 15, when I actually became interested. Prior to that, I just kind of messed around. And yeah, if anyone has any questions or comments, always feel free to suggest in the chat room there. Let's see where we'll start here. So, yeah, it's just pretty great. The pretty much modern Judaism, although we do connect ourselves all the way back to the Torah, which we got from Moshe, it really kind of begins with Ezra, the scribe, and our return under Cyrus and the Persian Empire to the land of Israel. We, at the time, had been taken, well, Judeans had been taken captives into the Babylonian areas. And though there were Jews still living in the land, they were mostly the poor tenant farmers. All the aristocracy and most of the priesthood had been taken into Babylon. And under Cyrus, there was a new enlightened age. We were free to rebuild the temple. We were free to practice our religion and have autonomy in our land. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah were both tied in with the priesthood, which is important to bring up because later this isn't going to always be true. They're part of what would be called the men of the Great Assembly. One of the main changes he did was ensuring that Torah could be disseminated to the average population. Although this was probably always kind of the goal with the Torah, it's what Faur calls the horizontal society, that everyone has a position, no one's above anyone else, they all kind of go on a level field. Unfortunately, due to the precious nature and sacredness of the text of the Torah, it seems that for many generations the priesthood kind of kept it to themselves. If you read about King Josiah, he specifically is shocked when the priests bring him a Torah scroll. So it obviously wasn't a part of the national studying. It wasn't part of our national day-to-day living. So he instituted the Monday and Thursday readings, the reading in the afternoon on Shabbat, in public. He also changed the script, actually. Prior to this, we'd been using a Hebraic script, and he switched over to the Syrian. It seems most people, other than some of the monarchs maybe, and some of the priests, no longer could read or even understand. In fact, in the book of Nehemiah, it talks about how Ezra would read and essentially translate and help them understand the words of the Torah. Yeah, it was... The people probably knew basic things about the Torah, but the priests, for the most part, didn't seem to be doing their part. Oh, that's a good question. I have the date here somewhere. So it was in... appears to be the 5th century when we have Ezra and Nehemiah, 5th century BCE, which is before Common Era. This essentially is the beginning of the Great Assembly. So let's see. This also is the beginning of the Samaritan Jewish schism. According to Jewish tradition, the Samaritans are descendants of people the Assyrians moved into the northern Israelite territory when they conquered and captured the northern kingdom of Israel. However, today we do kind of know the Samaritans were more of a mix. Again, the Assyrians probably only took off as captive the important Israelites, and tenant farmers remained. Obviously, other local populations were moved in, a little bit of mixing, but for the returning Judeans from Babylon, they saw them as kind of an undercaste, and they were concerned that the Samaritans had syncretized their beliefs too much with non-Jews. And so the Samaritans weren't actually permitted to help build the Second Temple with the Judean returnees. This would have implications between the Jewish and Samaritan relationships in the land of Israel for until this very day, actually. We don't really know much else specifically about the men of the Great Assembly. They, after Ezra and Nehemiah, we don't really see any names, though they do leave us a statement, if I can get to it, in Pirkei Avot. So their statements are to be deliberate in decision, to raise up many disciples, and to make a fence around the Torah. So we can see their focus was on personal vigilance in the Torah, to educate people, and to continue to build enactments. In fact, it's said that during that time they used to have 24 fasts to ensure that scribes did not become too wealthy. For if scribes became too wealthy, they would cease to write the Torah. That's how much focus was on for the Torah scrolls to be given to the local populations. The only named person we really have from the Great Assembly is Shimon the Just, who was a high priest. It's likely that the high priest retained a position as Nasi, or head of the Sanhedrin, for quite some time until the later schisms. So it's possible that also during the Great Assembly it was traditional for the high priest to be the leader of the nation on the spiritual level. Especially since we see in the Torah, it focuses on certain laws coming into effect and people being redeemed from those effects of the law when the high priest would pass away. So obviously it had a certain significance. Shimon the Just, he is connected through Midrashim to Alexander the Great. We've moved on from the Persian period. Alexander has now conquered most of the known world. He's brought Hellenism to the world. In fact, a lot of Jewish cities were now being modeled after the polis. There would be gymnasium, there would be Greek literature and philosophy being studied, and we start to see a shift in Judaism. The story with Alexander that they try to tie Shimon to, whether or not it historically actually occurred, specifically deals with the Samaritans again. It seems the Samaritans tried to approach Alexander, trying to get him to destroy the now rebuilt Jewish temple. And in return, it seems Shimon approached Alexander, and he is said to be the person that Alexander would see in visions and dreams before he had a victory. And so there's a turnaround. The Samaritans get their temple to be destroyed instead, though it seems more likely as a Hasmonean king much later who destroyed that temple. But why is this important? Shimon is representing the end of an era. The men of the Great Assembly were the remnants of people who still knew prophets. There are a few important prophets that still went back with the Judeans when they came to Israel, But now we're starting to see its scribes and essentially what we now call rabbis are moving into the legal realm. Prophecy is disappearing, no one's getting to have visions from God, and the Jewish people aren't getting to cope with that, especially in light of Hellenism. Hellenic thought focused on the human form, the perfection of man, which in Jewish tradition, if man is made in the image of God, why wouldn't Hellenic ideas be acceptable? So they're trying to make Shimon into a bridge. They're trying to show that you can still be a righteous Jew, you can still be the high priest of Israel, and in fact, the Hellenic culture bows to you. Alexander has his dreams and his victory because of the Jews, not the other way around. It's a very, very important statement at this time. And Shimon the Just is known for saying that the world stands on three things: Torah, worship, and acts of loving kindness. So his is connected again to the prior era. The men of the Great Assembly were actually the ones who started to establish communal prayer and blessings. And as high priest and Nasi of the Sanhedrin, he's trying to carry on this transmission from those he learned from. Let's see what else we have about him. Yeah, that's about all I have for him. Then we run into his disciple, Antigonus. And in my opinion, Antigonus is the first modern Jew. He's completely separated from the prophetic era. As opposed to his teacher, Shimon the Just. In Shimon's age, they said that is from Moshe to Shimon that there are no blemishes found in grapes in Israel. And after Shimon passed away, blemishes could be found. So we still have miraculous events being tied to Shimon, but in the age of Antigonus, this kind of ceases. And where's Antigonus' famous saying? So Antigonus, he's the one who talks about to be not like the servants who serve their master with the thought of reward, but rather like the servants who serve their master without thought of reward, and let the fear of God be upon you. So he's dealing with like how we are in the modern era. There's no seeming connection between justice, divine justice, and acts done in this world. Evil people get away with evil crimes, good people get punished. This is the world of Antigonus. And unfortunately, he managed to convey his message in too esoteric of a statement. Although his words would seem very wise, especially to us today, he seems to have led to a dispute, according to the sages' tradition. Is anyone familiar with the Sadducees in particular? So the Sadducees were a sect that mostly was part of the priesthood. They especially focused on only following the letter of the law. They're very strict in matters of purity. Whereas the Pharisaic or sage tradition tended to be a little bit more lenient in matters of purity. He apparently had two major schools of heresy, defined by the sages anyway, which descended from him: the Sadducees and Boethusians. Apparently, the disciples of his disciples and those disciples, in turn, they studied his words, And while reviewing them, they didn't understand why one shouldn't just then reap all their reward in this world, because if there's no connection to divine justice, then there is no world to come as well. Should be another major issue for them. The Pharisaic tradition does have a concept of an afterlife, whereas the Sadducees seem not to have any. Modern scholarship kind of contests this connection. They don't think the Sadducees or the Boethusians have any real connection to Antigonus. And also there's a question whether the Sadducees and Boethusians are even connected to each other in any way. We don't have a lot of information on the Boethusians, but Josephus even talks about the Sadducees, and the New Testament makes reference to them even. But again, this has to do with how the sages themselves, when they're compiling the Talmud, view the sects themselves. They saw Antigonus as fitting to transmit the tradition down to the generations, and they even relayed his words in Pirkei Avot, but they still saw him as being a little bit dangerous. Without proper context and without the instruction that's supposed to go along with his words, people could easily be led astray. Welcome, welcome. Got some new people. Let me collect some more of my notes. According to Rabbi Zacharias Frankel, he's of the opinion that Antigonus's teachings were actually, again, focusing against certain Hellenic ideas. He was focusing on Epicurus, the philosopher, if anyone is familiar with that. Today the word Epicurean is often used for those who like to try new types of foods, and essentially Epicurus saw that one should try to get as much pleasure out of this world as possible. And to do that, you need to do many different things. You need to try new events, you need to be very sexually active, you need to try as many different foods, varieties, travel if you can. And this was all kind of tempting to Jews in the Hellenic world, but it was seen as dangerous to the renewed nation. Remember, at this time, they're still subject to Hellenic policy, and for the Jews to survive as a people, they had a concept that they needed to be still distinctive. In fact, the root word that we use for kadosh, that we often translate as holy, is closer to distinctive or separated. So the concept that the sages were having was connected to this. Which is why according to Frankel, the addition at the end by Antigonus of "let the fear of heaven be upon you" to his statements is specifically to counter Epicurus just being focused on humanity. One has to keep in mind that though you can take pleasure from this world, there is still a God who's present to judge you. Which, if we see the Sadducees, so we have an Avot de Rabbi Natan, the Sadducees apparently said, "It is a tradition amongst the Pharisees to afflict themselves in this world, yet in the world to come they'll have nothing." So the Sadducees used to use silver and golden vessels, which is probably partly why, if Rabbi Frankel is correct that Antigonus was fighting against Epicureans, why the Sadducees are connected to him, even if modern scholarship would disagree. It's more that their philosophy is connected to what Antigonus was against. but they're worried that he was a little too wasn't specific enough with his words. Merely tacking on that one needs to fear God. I mean, how does one do that? You need a whole commentary alongside his words to understand what he's saying. And this concerned the sages a little bit. As we saw, his teacher, Shimon the Just, it's a lot easier to understand his words. It's pretty basic. Which moves us on to the Pharisees, after I've drank a coffee. So the Pharisees, in the Talmud, there ends up being a debate about what types of fear of God there are. Whether or not there's a fear of just love, or if there's a fear for fear's sake itself. And again, the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds have an argument about what exactly each one means. There's the famous maxim that get two Jews in a room, you get three opinions. And that never ceases to be true anywhere other than the Talmud. So we have in Tractate Sota, rabbis taught there's 7 types of Pharisee. The Shehemite, the knocking, the bloodletting, the pedestal, the what is my duty and I will fulfill it, the one who does out of love, and the one who does out of fear. They say so Rabbi Binyamin Lau has a really good book about the Mishnaic sages, and his breakdown of these types are: the one who acts the manner Shehem, that is, the person whose actions are motivated entirely by his own benefit, such as the circumcision of the men. In the famous story in the Torah, they're the ones who raped Dinah and were tricked by our Israelite forefathers into circumcising themselves so that they could get a chance to marry Dinah, and instead they got tricked and they went through and they killed all of them while they were circumcised and in pain. It's a very unique story in the Torah. The one who knocks his feet in the ground, this is the person who walks heel after toe, who avoids lifting his foot for fear of not finding where to tread, so he drags one foot after the other. So this person is, especially for the Babylonian tradition, this person would be the opposite of what they are looking for. You're supposed to try to find new ways to serve God, not just kind of drag along and stick to the status quo. The one whose blood spurts out in the walls. This is the one who averts his eyes from seeing evil. When he thinks he might see a woman in the street, he closes his eyes so that he bumps in the walls, injuring his head. So they're referring to... Yeah, they got slaughtered all weekend. They're referring to the kind of Jew who he ends up hurting himself for his fear of seeing evil in the world. This concept, when we have later classes, will kind of come up again amongst some of the sages themselves, actually. The pedestal Pharisee is one whose head is bent in humility when he walks. This is the person whose sense of fear makes him want to simply disappear. This is also bad. It's complete self-negation. You can't go around reducing yourself into nothingness. You are still an important aspect of the world, and God wants to use what He's given you. The what else should I do and I will do it is the one who's obsessed with fear, constantly looking for more strictures to obey. He can never relax because he's convinced that there always must be some additional obligation, some new stricture, some new task. This we even see in some communities today. There's always that one person in the synagogue who's reading a pure text, trying to find some new way and to keep a law and keep it, quote, better than other people. And the Talmud speaks against those types. It's fine to take on additional restrictions for yourself. In fact, there are sages that would do so, but this shouldn't be your goal in life. You should try to just be consistent with the law. Lift your head and live. Yeah, that's the best way to do it. So then we get into, beyond these guys, the Pharisee of love and the Pharisee of fear. The Babylonian Talmud is critical of both the Pharisee of love and the Pharisee of fear. Whereas in the Jerusalem Talmud, the passage is immediately followed by the Baraita of the 7 Pharisees. Oh, thank you. I got this from some friends. So, in the Jerusalem Talmud, they say the Pharisee of fear is Job, or Job, and the Pharisee of love is Abraham. And they say the most beloved of all is Abraham, the Pharisee of love. So the Jerusalem Talmud clearly prefers Abraham to Job, but the Misha and Sota has a little bit of a different opinion here. And it says in there that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hyrcanus was talking about that Job only served the Holy One, blessed be he, from love. As is said, though he slay me, yet I will wait for him. And if there's a doubt whether the meaning is, I will wait for him or I will not wait for him, there's another text which states, until I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. This teaches they acted out of love. Another Rabbi Yehoshua, this one of Ben Hananiah, teaches, will remove the dust from your eyes, Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai, since you have expounded all your life that Job only served the omnipresent from fear. As it said, that man was perfect and upright, that one feared God and eschewed evil. Did not Yehoshua, your disciple's disciple, teach that what he did was from love? So, until Ben Hyrcanus, apparently there's a distinction between fear-based service and love-based service. But it appears in they're arguing again that there are different types of fear, and even the one of love is kind of a fear situation. So the debate gets down to how one's supposed to serve God. And again, this has to do with the fact that they're kind of returning and rebuilding the Jewish establishment in Israel. So no one's really sure where the Jewish people are going from here. Today we're in kind of a nice position. We know what everyone thought, what everyone said, where the transmission went. Sometimes when you read the Talmud, the Amoraim actually have a little bit of an awkward situation in that the Tanaim will say things that the Amoraim feel like had already been solved. And it looks like I did not prepare as much as I thought I did. We supposedly got like 20 more minutes of class here. I guess, are there any questions about the current people? We have more questions about Persian or Hellenic culture, how it affected the sages of that time. Just waiting for any text to show up. Remember, anyone sign in as guest, you can just type into the chat and it'll prompt you to log in, and you can set up a little bit of an account. And if you have any trouble with it, Adi is our tech support, and is quite good at helping everyone. It's the only reason I'm able to do this at all. Okay. Knowledge of Pharisees? Do you have a particular question about the Pharisees, or? I'm sure everybody knows more than they think they do. Rather compliant with the Romans. Okay. Um, so the Pharisees in the period of when Jesus would have been alive are a little bit further along than our current timeline, but I can kind of discuss what ends up happening later. The Pharisees actually, the word is kind of derived from those who would separate. They actually weren't as compliant with the Romans. In fact, the Zealots, the Sicarii, mostly came from the Pharisees, or were at least related to them, if not exactly the same. The Sadducees actually were a little bit more inclined to support the Romans, namely because the priesthood tended to be bought in those days. Technically, Jews are supposed to be given religious autonomy, but the Romans tended to like to have a hand, at least in picking pro-Roman priests. It was beneficial to their control of the area. And in fact, in later classes, we'll discuss that there was a matter of debate amongst the sages on where they stood with the Roman Empire. There are those who viewed them as completely evil, those that viewed them as kind of neutral, and those who viewed them as actually rather helpful to the Jewish people. Just like with anything else, the relationship was actually quite complicated. There are Romans who became Jews, Jews who left Judaism to be a more Roman. There were people in the middle. Greco-Roman culture really did influence the Jewish people. We see, especially in the Gaonic tradition, that there's a lot of Greek philosophy, what would usually be called Neoplatonism, involved in Jewish texts and commentaries on the Torah and on the legal system. Though obviously given a Hebraic spin. Say the main differences that ended up happening was, even though the priesthood kind of was involved with the Sanhedrin and the Great Assembly when they're returning, there again became the schism, and the priests started to focus more on maintaining their authority rather than helping the people to be educated. And so the main difference with the Pharisees were promoting that horizontal society I talked about, whereas the Sadducees seem to be supporting a stratified society. Side by side affected the growth of Judaism. I would say it affected the direction that Judaism grew. For example, during the Persian time, another one of the things the Great Assembly is set with establishing are Havdalot. So the Havdalah service we have today, it bears a resemblance to certain Zoroastrian or Persian things that were done. Now, we always did have the concept of our holidays ending, but there wasn't probably as much of a ritual of ending it as there used to be. So if we continue to be under the Persian influence longer, until let's say Alexander hadn't invaded, Judaism would have evolved along that path. But we ended up with a Hellenic culture. So as Jews were attempting to adopt Hellenic philosophy, Hellenic lifestyle, the sages had to react. And they had to continue to make Judaism grow but in a manner that is acceptable to the population at large. A later authority than we've been dealing with now, Rabbi Akiba, he specifically uses the Greco-Roman cleaning of statues as an example of how Jews should treat their own bodies before praying to God. Washing your face and your hands used to be exclusively an issue for the priests. The priests have to be cleansed before they go into the temple precincts. And so then we started to bring that to the local population, and since this was a cultural sign of respect to clean these statues, if we are supposed to be in the image of God, it's our job to do the same before we present ourselves to the Heavenly Father. Yeah, Rabbi Akiva is quite famous. His time is very interesting when we get to that class. Very interesting. The ones that I presented today have a lot less information on them. Not personally. I should hope to meet him personally someday, maybe. We'll see. They say one of the stories about heaven is that you get to go and ask all the great sages questions, because invariably there's some misunderstanding about their words at some point. Any other questions about anything else? The backgrounds, the characters themselves? Unfortunately, I thought all of those would take longer. Otherwise, I would have prepared some of the zugot, which are the next phase. That's when we start to get pairs of instructors in the tradition, and also takes place during the Hasmonean period, which would be fitting for our current holiday. But yeah, the image of God thing is very interesting. Especially because in Hebrew it says Selam Elohim, which is more like a shadow of God. So this again has to be part of the issue that the rabbinic culture was focusing on, why they started putting more emphasis, I think, on the afterlife. Partly has to do with them pushing against the idea of the Hellenic perfection of body, and emphasizing the fact that we're like a shadow of God more than an image. Especially if you look in the Torah, it's pretty much devoid of any reference to afterlife. Anything it does refer to is almost invariably simply going to lay with your ancestors. After dealing with the Persians, Greeks, and Romans, there's a much greater emphasis on the afterlife. Oh, you did a class? You still have the video on here, or? So many quiet people in here. Should be on YouTube. You'll have to link me that sometime. I'd like to watch it. Yeah. Well, shadow is kind of more of a literal translation. Talking to the sages would be great. Definitely clear up a lot of things. Ask Antigonus how he felt about the later sages' opinion of his words, maybe. Okay, rundown of who the sages are, what they're about. Alright, so Jewish tradition, you have the written Torah, which is the Torah and the lay books you see are essentially what would be called the Old Testament in Christian communities. Alongside that, traditionally there's seen to be the oral tradition or the oral Torah. These were unwritten words which were passed down generation to generation. As I was mentioning at the beginning of this class, essentially when Ezra and Nehemiah return from Babylonian captivity is really kind of the beginning of the current Jewish oral and legal system that we have today. So the sages I was discussing today come from the Mishnaic period, which is the first and core part of the Talmud. The Talmud being a discussion of Jewish law, as well as allegorical stories that are meant to teach later generations. Originally, none of this was permitted to be written down, and specifically was supposed to remain oral so that it could be fluid and organic, continue to grow along with the Jewish nation, depending on where they were. However, during periods of persecution, it became important to write down the words of their teachers and ancestors, and so now we have texts today that we can research and look into. And what I hope to do with this class, as well as future classes, is address the character of the sage themselves, as well as the context of the age that they're in. Oh, we've got a lot more people joining. Welcome, welcome everyone. Oh, that's alright. I'm hoping to have more classes. This one was just the introduction. We went from the Great Assembly to Shimon the Just and Antigonus. And we'll be dealing with Hasmonean period. Rabbi Nachman, it depends. Are we talking about Rabbi Nachman in the Talmud, or are we talking about Rabbi Nachman from Uman or Breslov, depending on your particular importance to him? Unfortunately, one thing you run into is that Jews reuse names a lot. So there's quite a few Nachmans. Uman. So Rabbi Nachman is part of the Hasidic dynasties, which come a lot later and, at least for the perspectives of this class, isn't really considered a sage. For sages, we're going to be following more along the chain of transmission, starting with Ezra and the Great Assembly. What is going to be interesting, though, is probably next class, we'll be discussing certain people who call themselves Hasidim, but are not the same as modern ones who adopted the name when they started their movement with the Baal Shem Tov. There's going to be a little bit of a tension between the sages, the Pharisaic sages, and the Hasidim at the time, between those who focus on miracles and those who focus on the legal system. Since we've got a little bit more here, those who came in late, I was discussing how the kind of modern Jewish system that we have today was essentially established in the 5th century before the Common Era, when Cyrus, the Persian king, put an end to the Babylonian captivity of the Judeans. Ezra and Nehemiah come back, they rebuild the Second Temple, and they institute a system of nationwide learning. Consider it some of the first Jewish day schools, I guess, but mostly for adults, since a lot of people have been separated from the Torah, and it wasn't well read. He instituted the system of Monday and Thursday Torah readings, as well as the afternoon Torah reading on Shabbat. Some claim that this was instituted with Moshe himself, but we know it at least wasn't practiced until the times of Ezra, if that were the case. He also changed the script. We used to use a Hebraic script, which the Samaritans still use a version of today, and switched over to our modern script, which is Assyrian. This had to do with the local population in general not understanding the older archaic script. So he made some pretty radical changes. Then we had Shimon the Just, who was both high priest and Nasi of the Sanhedrin, and he was the only named member of the Great Assembly. He was kind of the bridge between generations. He was seen as a holdover slightly from the old prophetic era before we enter the age where prophecy no longer really carries over, and also as being a bridge between the heights of Judaism and the new Hellenic culture, because during his time Alexander the Great had conquered most of the known world. And the Hellenic world was kind of very enticing to the Jewish population, and a lot were leaving their traditional Jewish values for Hellenic values. And then we discussed Antigonus, the disciple of Shimon the Just. Antigonus lived in a world essentially devoid of miracles, and he's the one who promoted the famous maxim about serving God not for benefit, but merely for the goal to serve itself. And we discussed how, although this seems very wise, especially in a world where, despite the Torah giving very distinct examples of supposedly always going to have divine justice in the world, good people have good things happen to them, evil people have bad things happen to them, it's not actually true. And however, his way of presenting it was considered very esoteric, and later sages accused him of causing sectarian rifts in the Jewish community itself, with the Sadducees and Boethusians supposedly coming from him, and misunderstanding of his words. We also discussed how Rabbi Zacharias Frankel suggests that his words were actually a statement against Epicureanism, which Epicurus was a Greek philosopher, promoted trying as many things as possible. And whereas Antigonus was trying to teach moderation and keeping in mind that although the world is available for you and was created for humans according to the Jewish tradition, you still had to keep in mind that you would be judged for your actions in this world, and you couldn't just do whatever you wanted. That is pretty much a wrap of what we just talked about. I hope to get into the Hasmonean period next class, which currently I think I'm set for monthly classes. We'll see how popular they are and whether or not I can actually make enough material for each class in the future. This current class was a little smaller than I planned, but also the characters I was talking about in this class don't have as much information about them. Like I said, after Ezra and Nehemiah, we literally have no names for the Great Assembly until Shimon the Just. So we've got a really long period of time where no one is known distinctly as an individual. Thank you for attending. Do I have any more questions before I log? Glad you enjoyed it, Eddie. Hey, glad to help. I mean, I gotta use my yeshiva studies for something, huh? Thank you. I was fine, Sarah. There was a little bit of confusion on when the class was, but hopefully we'll have a schedule more in advance next time. I had to actually cancel the last time the class was supposed to happen due to various work issues, so it kind of set that up. Yes, as Ariel points out, please, it's the season for giving, and if you enjoyed this class, donate to OneShul, and it will help us continue to broadcast classes. And with that, I think I'm heading out. Thank you all for being a wonderful class. And sorry if I was a little bit awkward. It's interesting not seeing any faces when you're monologuing. And I guess I'll see you all next time. Have yourselves a great day and enjoy your Hanukkah season.